This is John Spink, and maybe a quick sound check, making sure everything's okay. Well, if I don't hear from you, then I'll follow the chat box here. Looks like everything is fine. So, welcome. I'm John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative here at Michigan State University, and I'm an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And that actually sometimes brings up some questions for people. Why veterinary medicine? But our food safety program is in veterinary medicine, and that's really where my work started and where a lot of the food fraud research started. And from there, we do deal with I'd say almost every group on campus. As you'll see through the presentation, from law to well, a wide range of things. We have a lot of information on our website, so please definitely look there. The blog posts aren't about what I had for lunch or something. They're usually something very substantial related to food fraud. So there's a lot of information there, a lot of resources, things like primer background documents, links to other training videos, longer reports, or other things like that. So we've got that there. So we have an hour together here today. I usually go about 40 minutes, so we can then have some time for some questions. Along the way, I'll watch the chat box and see if anything comes up. So that'll be the place to interact with me. So we'll get started. So for myself, the title is Food Fraud Audit Experience, Expertise, and Trends. First off, just briefly about us. So we're a university, and what we do is teach. That's the main thing that we do, and research, though. And so outreach is me being with you. Already putting this together led me to think about some of the recent updates and in the field, and even discussions the 15 minutes before this call with companies who are being audited or preparing for audits or just managing their business. So a lot of interesting activity. Next week, I actually go to Copenhagen and then Oslo, and presenting to the Scandinavian food agencies about food fraud. So they're reaching out all the way around the world. That outreach then goes back into research. So some questions come up, and then we do research them, publish on them, academic articles and other things, and that goes into education, the training, and back out to you for outreach. Now, if you're needing some background, like with GFSI, usually requires you have to demonstrate knowledge and an assessment of your knowledge. One thing that we do have are MOOCs, massive open online courses. So these are usually two-hour webinars. There's a certificate of completion. There are approximately 10 contact hours for each. And so there's an overview. There's audit guide for food fraud, audit guide for food defense. Don't forget, food defense is new and out there as well. And then overall about this concept of the vulnerability assessment and prevention strategy. But we'll cover all those things today. So if you are helping people through an audit or auditing, you'll get the background of what you need today. We also do short courses, executive education. Those are just more focused events. We have graduate courses. These are all online. So if you travel, if you don't live in Michigan, if you don't live in East Lansing, these are real Michigan State graduate courses, and 6 of them cover food fraud in one way or another. If you take 4 of those classes, then you're eligible for a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention, which just is a way to demonstrate you've got a bigger perspective or area of expertise in the area. And those credits can roll into a Master's of Science in Food Safety. And this is a real Michigan State Master's of Science as well. So, getting into the meat of the presentation, when we're looking at the whole audit experience, expertise, and trends, one of the things that's important to look at is GFSI itself and what GFSI's guidance is. Now, it's of course you're not really doing a GFSI audit. You're doing a food safety scheme standard that is GFSI endorsed or compliant. But to understand what those needs are and what might be going on in the marketplace, it's really important to look at what GFSI's really doing. So we'll cover this, and this was published in 2018, May 2018. First off, I think it's interesting to look at GFSI along the way and what they've done regarding food fraud. So really what happened is, as our first interaction with GFSI was in 2011. Some of the GFSI board members were on the S-Safe organization, which MSU was a part of, and met at MSU. That really got us thinking about GFSI and got them thinking about food fraud as a separate concept. In 2011, we published a peer-reviewed journal article defining food fraud, or defining the public health threat of food fraud. So that was when we'd say that food fraud really became a thing. It was started to be defined in an academic sense. If it's not in an academic journal article, then academics would say it doesn't exist, or are not aware that something actually exists. It was later that year, 2011, GFSI did create their next guidance document, version 6, and there was nothing in there about food fraud, really formally. There was a little bit that started into more broad food safety hazards, but it really wasn't that refined yet. And I do see a sound check looks good in the comments. Thank you. And then in 2012, so Sudan red had been a carcinogen colorant and fraudulently added in about 2004. Melamine is in 2007, and then GFSI kept thinking about this, and after the guidance document 6 came out, they started to think about what should be in the next guidance document. So in 2012, the GFSI board created a food fraud think tank, and there were 6 of us on it, and then eventually 4 of us, and then eventually 6, to really look to the GFSI board to say, what is food fraud, and is it something that GFSI should address at all? Just kind of, what is it? So while we were in the middle of that, in 2013, the horse meat incident occurred. All of a sudden, everything changed. There was a lot more focus because the big key there was looking at, boy, where else could this be? What else could be in there? So really, there was no awareness that there was this food fraud in there. It was a massive vulnerability. So that really led a lot of energy to this work. And in 2014, the GFSI board published a position paper on food fraud. So all this food fraud activity and requirements should be no surprise to anyone, because GFSI was crystal clear in 2014 of what the direction was going to be. Now, a lot of people thought they already had it covered, or they thought they understood it, or different scopes, and so maybe weren't aware of that, or didn't really take it seriously, I guess. But it was announced back then. In 2017 was this next guidance document, version 7. And then, so that's a requirement. It was February 2017, a requirement that food fraud would be, vulnerability assessment and prevention strategy would be required as of January 2018. So there again, no one should be surprised by this, when it came in January 2018, because it was a requirement in 2017. Here we are almost a year later from when it was required, and we still have people that are not exactly sure what they should be doing, or are getting audit nonconformances. And if you're an auditor, you got to give these audit nonconformances, because people aren't fully embracing the goal of GFSI. We'll get through some of that. So throughout the year, and so in the mid-year, it was clear that there was still a lot of confusion in the marketplace. So GFSI then published a this guidance document. Well, let's say first off, in 2011, food fraud was defined as a thing. There is such a thing. Food fraud became a real idea, so something that should be addressed there in 2012. Food fraud was really conceived, so if we say you've got a baby, the baby was conceived there in 2014, and it really was born with that requirement. Now there's a big reality check, and really what GFSI was able to do is create this this guidance document in May to really emphasize and define what had been discussed before, and so that's been very helpful, and that's what we'll go through right now in a little bit more detail. So it was May 2018. There's the link on GFSI's website. It was a food fraud review. They had a blog and a technical report. So this was a blog on GFSI's website by Jillian Kelleher of Wegmans. She's vice chair of GFSI, announcing it. And this was the report itself, Tackling Food Fraud Through Food Safety Management Systems. Now, the report itself was presented there at GFSI. The GFSI is authority, and these are familiar concepts, but just to remind us how it works. So the GFSI governance chart. Now, one thing you'll see here is the GFSI board in the middle. They're the ones that make the decisions. And that's the manufacturers, retailers, really those brand owners there. Now, you'll notice all these arrows go in. Recommendation, guidance, recommendation. Comes out, mandate. And it goes out, and it's a mandate to the technical working groups, local groups, and others to implement this. A key there is that GFSI board makes the decision. Now, what we've found from some companies is that they might not agree with everything GFSI did or the direction, but the bottom line is unless they get on the GFSI board or petition the board, these are the requirements that are in place. And it's very unlikely that there will be any changes to it until the next guidance document, which is about every 4 years. But food fraud is really something that's been needed by the board for those companies at that executive level. And so the requirements are very rooted in this enterprise-wide focus. In the GFSI technical document, it also did review again these 4 types of issues, 4 types of food risks: food quality, food safety, food fraud, and food defense. A key with this is that a food defense and a food fraud vulnerability assessment must be separate. They cannot be the same. That GFSI requires a separate and unique assessment for each. That's actually efficient. One thing that's been a challenge is there's been some other standards, such as PAS 96 in the UK, that combine the two. So that's fine for PAS 96, but the GFSI requirement absolutely positively is 2 separate assessments. So if you're auditing, you need to be able to see a company showing you their HACCP, TACCP, and VACCP, 3 separate assessments. And if they're combined, then they are not compliant. GFSI also presented on the different types of food fraud, and this reiterates the range of types of product fraud, including things that are outside the normal, supplier quality assurance focus or ingredients focus of theft, stolen goods, smuggling, things like that, counterfeiting, mislabeling. Because the key is that, so this was a presentation by Wegmans, a retailer. Wegmans needs all that manufacturer's products to be fine, everything with their brand name on it. So that's not just product coming in that is counterfeit, stolen goods, and others. That manufacturer, as you're buying ingredients, you're buying finished goods to be used, you need to also have all that product be without suspicion, without being recalled. And so that's this enterprise-wide approach. Once you shift from looking just at ingredients or substances or contaminants to this enterprise-wide approach, once you get a feel for it, it's really very simple, and that's something we'll go through here. So the presentation also emphasized, again, under this food safety management system umbrella, 3 separate assessments: food safety, food defense, and food fraud. So what we're just getting here is this overall summary and kind of review of what is all in there. Now, the conclusion that we came to, we published these food fraud initiative reports. So we reviewed the technical document of theirs. GFSI does not there's no new information in here. They're just reiterating or clarifying their previous statements. Food fraud is a critical component of a food safety management system. It is not optional. And there's sometimes some confusion that this is an add-on, a bolt-on, or something like that. It is not. GFSI emphasizes this holistic scope, all fraud and all products. So it's clearly from adulterant substances to counterfeits to stolen goods. Stolen goods, if they're mishandled, could be a problem, and as well as they would be adulterated foods under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. So they're illegal, unfit for commerce. And all products, that's incoming goods all the way through to products in the marketplace, including counterfeits. Second, GFSI's emphasis is to just get started. So HACCP is over 25 years old, and here we are, food fraud is a year old, almost a year old maybe, let's say 2 years old maybe, but that's not very far along. 25 years versus 25 months, very different. So GFSI is emphasizing just get started, and there's this continued emphasis on just starting the process, and then looking at the sharing of best practices. So that's something we're starting to see more of, companies starting to get together and look at that. Auditors are to confirm the process, not judge the plan. So this is something really difficult for auditors. You're used to really going in and looking at and really having a thorough evaluation of the application of a food safety management system, of HACCP. That is not the case yet. And I'll say I deal with food fraud every day. My wife might say all day, all weekend too. Think about that. It's very difficult to still understand what is the best approach or most thorough approach for each company, because every situation is different. We're starting to learn about those nuance, the nuance of each of those companies. So that's a real key as we're looking at this, the audit, and we'll go through the details. That there's some key attributes, requirements of the GFSI standards And it's just to hit on those, that people do have a prevention strategy, they have it in place and it's documented, things like that. So it's very functional, and it's actually optimal for right now. That's something that's really odd as well. Also, just to reiterate, the definition includes all types of fraud for all products. That includes counterfeit, stolen goods, mislabeling, misbranded, and it includes everything. It includes a company monitoring all the way through the marketplace. So to look at GFSI itself, now one thing that's interesting, there's 13 or 14 sections of GFSI. Each of them does have this food fraud vulnerability assessment entries. There's not a lot of information or detail here. This is it for the vulnerability assessment. So I think it's 27 words. I mean, we're academics, we count these kind of things. That's not a lot of detail. But there's several key points here that we will get into, and GFSI got into in the technical document. First off, the standard shall require. So that is GFSI saying that the food safety standards, that's BRC, FSSC, IFS, SQF, whoever, the standard shall require that the organization is the entire company. So if you're auditing Wegmans, or you're auditing Mondelez, or you're auditing Cargill, you're auditing their entire organization, not just the plant, not just that facility, it's the organization. And people say, well, how does the plant have control of all this? Well, the key is that the plant is a part of the bigger organization, so the plant would have processes in place that are more universal. Think about like a vacation policy. Every plant doesn't have their own vacation policy. Every plant, though, is held accountable with applying the policy that's the corporate policy. So that's where the organization, a plant, is required to in that case, to apply and follow this corporate policy. So the standard shall require that the organization, and then has it documented, so they must be able to show it to you. You have to do that to be able to demonstrate that you actually have it, or an auditor to review it, documented. Food fraud vulnerability assessment procedure in place to identify potential vulnerability and prioritize food fraud mitigation measures. Now, does this tell you which method needs to be used? No. Does this tell you how deep it needs to be? No. It just says that it has to be documented as a food fraud vulnerability assessment procedure. That there's so basically, as an auditor, you're looking at this and saying, is there a procedure? Is it an assessment, and is it followed, and is it documented? So that's the most basic piece of it. The key is that we'll get into this later, but this is so important because companies now have to put these in place. And I can tell you one thing that I've seen is a big sense of urgency, especially if they know an audit is coming or they get an audit non-performance, then they do move ahead and they then put these in place. That's what each person in the GFSI chain needs. As I said, with Wegmans at one end, they need to have Mondelez have this under control. Mondelez needs to have Cargill have this under control, and Cargill needs to have their suppliers under control. That's what this is getting everybody onto the same page. The next requirement is for food fraud mitigation plan or prevention strategy. So to go through this kind of point by point, the standard shall, so again, that's the standard, require that the organization, so again, you might be doing a site inspection, a plant or headquarters or wherever, but it's about, are you following a overall plan for a corporation? Has a documented, so that's a key, plan in place that specifies the measures the organization has implemented to mitigate the public health risks from the identified food fraud vulnerabilities. This now says documented plan to address those vulnerabilities that you just identified in the procedure above. Again, this doesn't say that it doesn't say how many have to be identified, how much detail. It just says that you have to have the starting point. A key is the first step of a strategy is implementing the strategy. So they're starting to put these measures in place. They're implemented to mitigate the public health risks. Now, starting a plan is the beginning of implementing those plans. It doesn't say that there is no risk at all, that there's no vulnerabilities, but that just that there's measures in place to mitigate those risks, and that's the start of the process. And that's real key. It's just getting the process started. Finally, they emphasize further this whole idea shall cover the relevant GFSI scope. Now, they split this out. This really is assumed in the previous items, but they split it out to really emphasize what is the GFSI scope. So at this point, we'll go into what was exactly in these are GFSI documents. We'll go into the technical document itself and then look at some of the clarification of some of those key points. To start off, every vulnerability does not need a control plan. So before we even get going into those definitions, what we want to do in this situation is we want to look for as many vulnerabilities as we can find. And then we'll start to assess whether they do need a control plan. Now, maybe before horse meat occurred, horse meat wasn't a problem. And so maybe a company wouldn't address that. But what we'd like to say is species, hopefully species substitution was on the list. And maybe for 1 year that wasn't a problem. So if you as a company saw that maybe you saw that happen in the UK, then maybe the next time you looked at this, then maybe you would say, whoa, we should probably look at horse meat now. So hopefully then it would trigger you to look at this a little bit sooner rather than later. So we'll look at the terminology, and this is the types of fraud. So the appendix of the technical document has this list here. And what you'll see is on the left-hand side, this is what's been kind of a traditional GFSI list. And then earlier, actually, if you follow some of our works, this was from our first, back 2011. So, you know, a number of years earlier, 5+ years earlier, were some basic concepts. But here are the definitions of the full type of food fraud. What you'll see here is gray market theft and diversion is definitely there. Mislabeling, branding, counterfeiting, intellectual property rights, and then some examples there too. So you've got the sources: dilution, substitution, concealment, unimproved enhancements. These are all kind of a substance in there, or contaminant, maybe you call a substance, adulterant. Mislabeling could be country of origin labeling, could be weights being off, could be if there's a substitution up there, probably it's a mislabeling problem as well. And then gray market production, theft, and diversion. Now, one thing that we get a challenge there is, well, a lot of that's not illegal. Well, that's true, but you want to monitor gray market production because if there's gray market product moving around the world, then that means that's product outside of your control. Same with diversion, which is pretty similar there. But the product intended for one market sold in another. Gray market is products sold out of an authorized distribution network. The key is that if there's that product or stolen goods, then there could be less transparency, less control of the supply chain. At that point, if there's a lot of gray market and diverted product, then companies should look a little bit closer to look for things like counterfeits or other types of product that has been mishandled. So you'll see there's a wide range of sources for all that definition. So as an auditor, what you'd like to see is a company state that they are addressing all types of fraud per GFSI, including because then if they make that statement, then they're not just saying that there's no confusion about what their scope of all food fraud is. That if they list this, it's very effective to do that. There's some resources there as well. Now, one thing just in there, GFSI points out, their position paper, benchmarking documents, others, but then there are 2 videos. And one thing that we'll point out is those are videos that we presented, an overview of what is GFSI and the think tank that was presented at a conference, at the GFSI annual conference, and also the concept of terminology in more detail. It was presented at a GMA conference, but that gives a little bit more background as well for resources. So to get into terminology, this is, again, the important part as an auditor or looking at these systems is to look at exactly what is clearly defined by GFSI. And so it's shown here in the position paper and benchmarking document that both definitions cover all types of fraud, all products, and highlight that the motivation behind food fraud is intentional and economically driven, potentially linked to criminal activities, and at least aiming to avoid detection. So GFSI is crystal clear. It does cover all, I mean, it's quoted, covers all types of fraud in all products. Further, later, it states this implies that any plans and activities to mitigate, prevent, or even understand the risks associated with food fraud should consider an entire company's activities. So right there, that's incoming goods, product in process, product out to the marketplace, product in the marketplace, contract manufacturers, technology transfer, and even counterfeits in the market. Usually a corporate security group is looking at that, and a lot of times the operation or food safety group might not know that, because a lot of that is very commercially sensitive information. But an entire company's activities, including some that may not be within the traditional food safety or even HACCP scope. Well, of course, HACCP is operations. It's things that occur in that plant, in your control. And HACCP also is defined to be measuring things that cause an actual health hazard. Also that critical control points or controls in that facility could help mitigate those health risks. If there's a problem with counterfeits in the market, the plant has nothing to do with it. Now the corporation does. So the plant would have to be able to talk about the corporate activities and really applying methods closer to criminal investigation. That is absolutely right on. This is a criminal investigation. If the biological organism in question was a human, we'd go to the field of microbiology or toxicology, things like that. But the biological organism in question isn't a microbe, it's a human. So we go to the field of criminology, and this is really looking at a criminal investigation. Also, something important to point out is you as an auditor, you're a food safety auditor. You're not a criminal investigation auditor. And so this is a big deal for audit companies, as well as auditors themselves for physical violence. Also for companies that are sending auditors in to be aware of their insurance coverage, because the insurance coverage probably does not cover criminal investigations for the auditors. That's something that should definitely be reviewed. In a lot of cases, companies, including Dan mentioned this at the GFSI conference, their chief security officer, Bernard Galea, was there. He stated that when they find fraud activities, they immediately turn it to corporate security, because turn it over to the experts in that field. There's a lot of other issues that could go on, including collecting information for a court case. You know, criminal investigation has a different level of evidence control. So we'll look quickly at the standard and just emphasize again, like I've said it, but I want to put it on the slide. So there's a public record, I guess, a written record. The standard shall refers to the food safety management system, which could be the BRC, FSSC, IFS, S2F, or others. So that's a real key at the very start. People miss that when they're reading that. If they've read that original GFSI section at all or not, they sometimes miss that. Second is just some clarification again on the organization. So the requirements refer to the organization, and while traditional HACCP-type food safety approaches apply at the manufacturing facilities, these operate within the overall organization. The food fraud vulnerabilities are company-wide, and thus the food fraud scope is company-wide. End quote. So again, that's not my interpretation of it. That's a quote from GFSI. And again, the GFSI technical document is a document from the board of directors. So really what we see is our note is that food fraud is more of a top-down assessment than food safety or food defense that is facility-based hazards. So if you're really food safety hazards or food defense is access, that's physical local access to things, more so than food fraud is something that, it's purchased product from around the world. It's product out in the marketplace. So food fraud is more of a top-down assessment, more like human resources type policies. And so to go into that a little bit further, we'll talk about this top-down or bottom-up. And this is not in the technical documents, our summary of it, but it depends on the process and the root cause. And really to look at if the controls are best being facility-based or enterprise-based. For food safety, you've got this bottom-up approach because you're looking at the drains, the water, the sanitation systems, the processes at the plant facility of how things, if it's got kill steps, if the kill steps are being managed. And then those facility-based risks are consolidated upwards. And really corporate has a lot less to do it. So we've got food safety going upwards, food fraud going down. Because if you're buying product from around the world, that's where more of the risks are going to be, getting the product in, or setting corporate-wide food authenticity tests, things like that. Those are things that happen very broad across the entire enterprise. And then the requirements of the plant facility may be very, very little. So I ran a plant for Chevron, a package fill for industrial oil, and really we had a guy that ran the lab. And my job as the plant manager was to confirm that he did his job and did whatever tests were asked of him that day, and he did it properly. So, we had a process improvement to make sure to validate that he was doing the test the right way in training, and he just confirmed he was asked to do these 10 tests, and he did them. And a lot of times for a plant facility, that's all they need to do is to confirm that they're doing what the next level up and the next level up asks them to do. I think as an auditor, something that you'll see is some of these plant audits, they may have talking points. They may have one page that they just read about each of the BRC aspects, and they read them off. And the key is that they just know what they're supposed to be doing. That they can state, we do have a corporate-wide assessment that we follow, and here's my few steps. So next, just an emphasis that GFSI points out is all vulnerabilities are not hazards. So again, this is not our summary, this is quote from the document. While an all hazards assessment approach is important, all vulnerabilities are not risks. All risks are not hazards, and all hazards are not hazards that require preventive control. Right there, it's crystal clear. So as an auditor, you want to see people identifying a lot of vulnerabilities, and most of those vulnerabilities could be 90+%, could be 95% plus, are not hazards that require preventive control. But what we want to see is we want to see people looking at a lot of them. We don't want people to be shy when they're looking at it. I will say to everybody, if some questions come up, feel free. I'll be looking at the chat board there. Another point that is throughout GFSI, but not exactly a quote, is about the vulnerability. And it's clear that the companies need to assess every, not each. So what we mean by that is, the basic GFSI requirement is to address every or all vulnerabilities, not each one. What we mean by that, or not yet anyway, people will drill down as need be, but it's most efficient to look company-wide. And there may be entire classes of products, maybe products bought by somebody, by one company. There might be one company that has a lot of supply chain controls and delivers the product to your facility, or you pick up there, where there's no middleman. There's nobody that takes control of that product other than you or them. There may be entire classes of product. It could be some of the most fraudulent product in the world. But if you're buying it, FOB their dock or FOB your dock, then if that supplier has strong supply chain controls, then every bit of product you buy from that company, if you confirm the supply chain controls, may be very low. So all those companies, it would be a waste of time. You're not judging the individual ingredient, you're judging that supplier as a group. The other thing is maybe you have, for incoming quality control, maybe you have a process that requires honey to be a very, very tight specification. So that might lead you to have a lot of oversight of the honey. You might be looking at color, flavor profile, viscosity, things like that. And so if you have a big need from a specification standpoint, then it might be that there's a very low fraud opportunity. So even for some type of ingredient that has a high fraud opportunity in general, your processes might be placed such that you would really identify them. So definitely it's most efficient for companies first to make sure that they cover every product, but not each. Look very broadly and then define why they stay broad or not. And again, the big point at the beginning is that they have a process in place, and that's really it. So back to the specific GFSI document and their quotes there. So this is getting to the auditor themselves. And this is really important as we're getting into look at what your role is, what your optimal role is, and really helping the efficiency of an auditor. But during a food safety certification audit conducted against a GFSI recognized scheme, the auditor will review the documentation related to the vulnerability assessment process and, here we go, confirm that a comprehensive control plan, as outlined in the position paper appendix, has been developed and implemented by the company. This is not saying that you're assessing how competent it is. Just first that you confirm that a comprehensive plan. So that comprehensive plan is a vulnerability assessment and prevention strategy that covers all products and all fraud. And that was outlined before. Second, with this in mind, there's an awareness that addressing food fraud is new and different for those being audited as well as the auditors. So GFSI is, auditor competence and auditor training is a real key focus for GFSI, something they take very seriously. And it's being aware of what your capabilities are. And it's a very busy situation doing an audit. Adding a lot of things like food fraud just adds a lot of time as well. So GFSI is aware of both those being audited and the auditor. So there's some good clarity that is provided. The auditor is not expected to detect food fraud or affirm that an anti-fraud program is capable of, quote, preventing fraud. This approach is very much in line with the verification of a HACCP plan during the food safety audit. There's a quote there, or a citation from them. So the key here, again, you're not assessing how how efficient this is at detecting fraud or the anti-fraud program or preventing fraud. You're identifying that there's a plan in place and they follow it. And specifically that it covers all fraud and all types of products. So the audit depth. GFSI went on further to talk more about this. Again, this was in the position paper and in the technical document. The GFSI is aware that harmonization and best practices are just now being developed and refined. A new system less than a year old in implementation cannot be expected to be as robust, thorough, or detailed as a system such as HACCP has been implemented for more than 25 years. And then the most important step for the food industry is to just start addressing fraud and for auditors to start asking these basic questions on how vulnerabilities were assessed and identified and strong mitigation plan thought through. So again, this is just the real focus. The optimal role of that auditor is just to get started in the process. Companies need to know that you're going to ask the questions, and you're going to look at the documents to make sure they're in place. And if they just know that you're going to ask the questions, and you do ask the questions, then definitely companies are responding to that, and then they're working together to identify these best practices. So that's a real key from this standpoint. So that's the end of the official GFSI document itself. But then what we'll do is we'll go into a little bit more detail of what are these requirements and what they look like. So things, when we really boil down the GFSI requirements, one thing we did is went back and looked at the early stages of a lot of different types of standards, and specifically quality management, such as Six Sigma, ISO 31000, things like that. And so this first step is for this required document to understand what are required documents, because people are trying to get ready for the audit, ready for you to come in. So when you do go to audit, some things that you might see first is a specific document that clarifies the details, and that they're doing this at least annually, of a food fraud vulnerability assessment and rank. Now, this can be a one-page document. GFSI doesn't say how long it could be. Shoot, it could be a half page, it could be a quarter page, but it probably is going to be a one-pager that's going to explain the vulnerability assessment, the method that they use, who did it, when they did it, things like that. It also should identify, and you should be able to see there that it says it's going to cover all types of fraud, list those types of fraud and all products, and list them as well. There'll probably be some type of chart or a risk map that will show something on there. Not a lot of detail is required, especially if people do these real summaries. Next is a food fraud prevention strategy. So there's two parts of that, and then the third part of GFSI was just that it covers their definition. So the second document is this prevention strategy. So again, it would define the method, define what they're doing, and really, like with other types of processes, you want to look at if they state what they're going to do and then they confirm that they did it. That's the real key here. And what we want to see is that some type of method is explained, and this is an ongoing method. Now, something that we've seen, what we try to do is give a recommendation for all the standards as well. So looking at especially IFS, but some others, is that we recommend two other documents that companies produce or have available. One is a food fraud policy, that they have some document, one-page document that summarizes their corporate policy. This is how they deal with it, where they deal with it up in their company. The other is something that IFS required, and I think it's something that's really great to do, is to have a review of the past audit results. So, I mean, if anything, companies should have that internally, but that would be helpful for you to see what they've gone through before, and then just to explain how they responded to those audits in the past. So what we've got here is, when you going in, hopefully you as an auditor know what you know what you can expect to see, and if they lay it out in these 4 documents, then hopefully that's a pretty efficient audit. What I recommend with people, what they do is that they ask you, hey, when we get to the food fraud section, can I just show you our 4 documents, and then maybe we can go through the questions that you have. That's a great way for them to lay it out if they do. If not, you can go through question by question from whichever standard you're looking at. So, here's a good one of data gathering. How much data is needed? This is something that's a concern for auditors looking at it, but companies as well. So we actually did a peer-reviewed scholarly article looking at this initial screening and vulnerability assessments. And one thing we looked at is sources of data to get started. And what's really odd, I guess, is that very early in these assessments, the very first assessments are very high level. And actually the academic literature recommends subject matter expert insight. So, you go out and try to gather data, but what data do you gather? If you've never ever looked for data on stolen goods, how would you know where to go look? Counterfeits in the marketplace, things like that. So it's really most efficient to start with subject matter expert insight. So that's something you might see as something that is mentioned. Known incidents within the company. So that's the next step, a little bit more formal. So you can look internally and you list incidents, you list the details and costs if known, and these are internal sources. So there's an awareness of what's occurred. A lot of times those might be suspicious activity or near misses. Those are things internally that are good to look at to get started. Then databases. And we would say this is looking at external sources. So that could be just general databases. There's food fraud databases. It could be product recall information. That's just really the next step. Then internet searches. So we call these dynamic external sources. So a database is a snapshot in time until someone updates it. But a key is that dynamic. So these could be automatic keyword searches, and we've seen in literature as well, including FDA, looking at Google alerts. So that's something out there you could say. So say you only buy pomegranates from New Hampshire, then you could set up Google alerts for pomegranate and New Hampshire fraud, pomegranate and New Hampshire recall, things like that. And then you can refine those to know what you're doing. Now, from a process standpoint, is to say we monitor Google alerts, we monitor on a monthly basis, and here's the documentation that we are monitoring it. And so that's even general internet searches as well. And again, that's supported by the literature. So there's academic citation that people can use. So there's a constant challenge or criticism of GFSI. It's just a checkbox, yes or no. People are just doing it to get through the audit. Well, we reviewed that for food fraud, and definitely that's often a criticism. Is this bad for food fraud and for this stage right now? That's a good question. So okay, yes. So someone could just handwrite on a piece of paper. That's technically documented, right? Oh, I'm gonna look on the internet once a month, and here I listed it. So, but is that okay for now? Is it bad now? No, it's not bad now because the formal and official process has started. A key is companies need to know what questions you're going to ask in general, and you need to ask those questions. When you do that, I can tell you from experience, the wheels get turning. So companies are responding. Now, maybe they just barely get by with the first audit, but they understand where their gaps and weaknesses are. And there's a series of events that occurs. After that first yes or no question that you could be asking for each of the GFSI aspects, there's a series of events that occurs. Usually that plant person is not authorized to just write up the document to show you. It usually goes to someone internally. It probably goes to the plant manager. Probably at that point, when it's the first document, it goes into corporate, either into compliance, regulatory affairs, general counsel, things like that. And what we've seen a lot of times is that documentation goes all the way up to the very highest level, to maybe not the general counsel themselves, but general counsel's office and the compliance office, just to review what you're stating in the marketplace. Now, you might not see, you as a company, might not see that go up. It might just kind of come back with some guidance. You might hear from, quote, corporate, but we've seen a lot of times it goes way up. And the starting point is you auditors just starting to ask those questions. This is the optimal role for you now. It's the formal and official process has started. So, what are those questions? And that's one thing that I guess we as academics look through the literature. We look at precedents. We look at the application. We look at the time of an audit, things like that, and what could be the first step. And these are published in New Food and Food Safety magazine, and then also in a blog post for us. But here they are. So what we've got is the general compliance requirements are. So what we did is we boiled them down to 7 yes or no questions. It sounds so ridiculously simple. It sounds like we're just trying to get away with something. But again, we're not. This is a part of the bigger system that is actually working and helping. So first, conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment. So I'll think about one company that we dealt with. They conducted 3 assessments for 3 products in great detail. So conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment. Yes. Written. Yes, it's documented. Now, still, this doesn't feel very good because they're not controlling their whole process, but you're only at question 2 of question 7. So we'll keep following. Implement a food fraud prevention strategy. Yes or no? And they say, well, yeah, we have one. Okay. Is it written? No. So at this point, they've said yes, 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 but now they've got to know. They're not compliant at this point. And you, as an auditor, you need to identify this. They need to get an audit nonconformity for this. They need to. This is a part of the entire process. It needs to be written. But let's say that they did have it written on a piece of paper. Even handwritten could technically be written. Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review. So back in the vulnerability assessment, you would ask them, how did you conduct this review? And they need to have a method and explain that they did it at least annually. Well, this just came out in January, so anybody that did their assessment probably did it within the last year. So that might even be a yes as well. So they've got the 4 yeses and 1 no. Now it gets tougher for people. Address all types of food fraud, yes or no. So maybe that assessment was for 3 products, and let's say that they did cover all types of fraud. Okay, so they've still got a yes, but then address all products, both incoming goods to outgoing goods through to the consumer. All products. They did 3 assessments for 3 products. They did not address all products. So all of a sudden, they've got these 2 areas where they have an audit nonconformance. The key is then when you're looking at it and you're explaining it, you're giving them very clear direction on where they are not compliant, of where they are lacking in their focus. And the key here was when people have got the audit nonconformity, the details that have been provided in that have led companies to know exactly what they need to do. And a lot of times, seeing it in the audit nonconformance creates the real spark. They go do address it. If you need a citation for that, here's a couple of them, and then they refer on to some of our other academic articles. So right there is a good start for the audit itself. It sounds really simple, but I wanted to make sure to emphasize that that's the most efficient way to start, and that's really the ideal role of the auditor to get started. So with that, we come to about the end here of the content. I wanted to emphasize that you're key to the process, and if there's things in here, if you've got lessons learned for us, insight, recommendations, adjustments, you're key. Please. My information is there because I would like to talk to you. I need to talk to you. I need to understand this. So invite me in, give me a call, things like that, for us to interact and figure out how to keep moving this forward. If you think there's things that the customers need, more resources, that's something that we can do maybe a better job of presenting those. We probably have the information on our website already. We have a tab for primer documents. Tab for reports, other like training videos. We've got the MOOCs, the massive open online courses, so there should be some training there as well. And I think finally, as you as auditors and as audit company, let us know what you need in the way of further training, insight, reports, other types of resources with that. So with that, I guess we'll close out the recording and then see if any questions come up. If they don't, that's fine, and we'll take it from there. Thank you. Okay, well, you gave you a second there. So unless the other organizers have any comments or things like that, we'll close out and we'll say thank you everybody for attending.